The war was over, but no one inside the camp moved. It was early morning, May 1945. Mist drifted across the flattened fields of northern Germany, carrying the faint smell of wet earth and burned diesel. The wooden barracks stood silent, their walls stained by rain and time. Outside, a U.S. Army captain approached the gate, his uniform dusty, eyes weary from months of war. He turned the key. The lock snapped open with a dull metallic click that echoed through the camp. The gate creaked, swinging outward. Freedom, at last. But behind the wire, the women did not walk forward. Dozens of German female prisoners, former Wehrmacht clerks, nurses, auxiliaries, stood motionless. Their hands gripped small bundles of belongings. Their faces were pale, unreadable. Some stared at the horizon. Others looked down, whispering to themselves. The Americans waited. Still, no one stepped outside. The silence was heavier than the war itself. Freedom had come, yet no one seemed to want it. And in that frozen moment, the captain realized something far deeper than victory or defeat was unfolding before him. In the final weeks of World War II, Germany was collapsing from within. By April 1945, Hitler's armies were in full retreat on every front. Cities lay in ruins. Railways were shattered. Millions of civilians were fleeing westward, desperate to escape the advancing Soviet forces. Amid this chaos, countless members of Germany's auxiliary military organizations, especially women from the Luftwaffe, Wehrmacht, and Kriegsmarine support units, were swept into the storm of surrender. Many had not seen combat. They had typed reports, driven trucks, served as radio operators, or worked in field hospitals. Yet, when Germany capitulated on May 8, 1945, they too became prisoners of war. Allied troops, British and American alike, suddenly found themselves responsible for tens of thousands of female POWs scattered across makeshift camps from Schleswig-Holstein to Lower Saxony. The surrender created logistical chaos. Camps had to be erected overnight. Fences went up around abandoned airfields and farm pastures. Food was rationed, sanitation improvised, and order maintained by exhausted young soldiers who, days earlier, had been fighting their captives' comrades. Yet the conditions inside these Allied-run facilities were far from brutal. Compared to the devastation outside, the camps were structured, predictable, and safe. Prisoners received rations, medical care, and, in some cases, work assignments. For many of the women, it was the first time in months that they could sleep without the sound of artillery or the fear of Soviet revenge. Beyond the wire, Germany no longer resembled a nation. The Nazi regime had collapsed, its leadership dead or in hiding. Cities like Hamburg, Hanover, and Bremen were smoldering shells, their populations starving and homeless. The propaganda that had once promised victory had turned to silence, and amid that silence, a strange reality began to emerge. Captivity, once feared, was now a kind of refuge. When the Allied occupation began, the treatment of female German prisoners posed an unexpected dilemma. Unlike their male counterparts, these women had served in a gray area. Neither front-line soldiers nor ordinary civilians. Many had worn uniforms, carried sidearms, or worked directly for Nazi command structures. Yet, by the laws of war, their role was ambiguous. The Allied command debated whether they should be classified as combatants, civilians, or something in between. In early May, American and British officers received orders to process all captured personnel under standardized POW regulations. Camps such as those near Lübeck, Neumünster, and Eutin began filling rapidly with German women, some barely in their 20s. Inside, the Americans enforced discipline, but also maintained a measure of humanity rare in war's aftermath. There were roll calls, cleaning duties, medical inspections, and a routine that provided structure amid uncertainty. But beyond the fences, chaos reigned. Refugee columns stretched across ruined roads. Civilians scavenged for food among bombed-out houses. In the east, Soviet troops advanced with a reputation that terrified nearly every German woman who had heard the stories from Silesia or East Prussia. Violence, looting, and retribution were rampant. Inside Allied camps, word of these horrors spread quickly. For many of the women prisoners, freedom meant stepping into a country that no longer existed, a wasteland of hunger and vengeance. Some had lost their families. Others feared arrest by local authorities for even minor connections to the Nazi regime. So, when American officers informed them they would soon be released, the response was not relief. It was fear. In the order and security of captivity, they found something the outside world no longer offered: safety, food, and a fragile sense of dignity. The wire, once a symbol of defeat, had become a shield. It was in this uneasy balance between captivity and chaos that the moment at the camp gate would unfold. For the women behind the wire, the war had ended, but not within them. They woke each morning to the same distant hum of trucks, the same gray sky. Breakfast came in tin bowls, watery porridge, black coffee, sometimes bread if the supply trucks made it through. Yet even in this monotony, there was something profoundly human: the slow rediscovery of survival after years of ideology and fear. Some of them had joined the war effort out of duty, others through persuasion, propaganda, or the simple lack of choice. Many had worked as clerks or switchboard operators, never holding a weapon, yet now stood among those branded as enemies. They carried shame, not only for Germany's defeat, but for having served a cause that had consumed millions of lives. Each woman carried a private memory: a lost brother on the Eastern Front, a father vanished in Stalingrad, a fiancé who never returned from Normandy. Within the fences, those unspoken losses drew them together. They shared cigarettes, letters, fragments of news. They spoke softly, sometimes about the war, more often about what might come next. If anything waited for them beyond the wire. For many, captivity offered something paradoxical: order. The American guards enforced rules, but those rules brought stability. They knew when to rise, when to work, when to sleep. Outside was only uncertainty, the ashes of a country divided and shamed. Freedom meant facing what they had lost: their homes, their nation, their belief in everything they were taught to trust. For some, it meant facing judgment from their own people, who viewed returning POWs with suspicion. In that fragile calm, time became a strange companion. Days passed in slow rhythm, and rumors of release stirred more anxiety than joy. The gates represented not liberty, but exile. So, when the order finally came that the camp would open, many felt no triumph, only dread. They had entered captivity as prisoners of a defeated Reich. Now, they remained inside as refugees from a broken world. For the Americans stationed at the camp, the war's end was supposed to bring relief. The gunfire had stopped, and the flags of surrender flew over every German town. Yet the men assigned to guard the prisoners soon discovered that peace carried its own kind of burden. The camp near Uton was commanded by Captain Robert Hayes, a 34-year-old officer from Ohio. Hardened by years in Europe, he had seen the inside of Normandy's hedgerows, crossed the Rhine under fire, and watched towns burn as the German front disintegrated. When the order came to establish a holding camp for surrendered personnel, he expected resistance, defiance, perhaps even hatred. What he found instead was silence. The German women obeyed every order. They lined up quietly for roll call, kept their barracks clean, and never attempted escape. Hayes and his men were puzzled. They treated the prisoners correctly, following the Geneva Convention to the letter. But something about the camp felt unsettling, as if the captives were waiting for something that would never come. When word arrived that the women were to be released, Hayes gathered his men and read the notice aloud. There was no celebration from the prisoners, no rush to pack belongings, only quiet murmurs and stillness. The younger soldiers joked nervously that the women liked it too much here. Hayes didn't laugh. He understood, in a way his men didn't, that freedom could terrify as much as captivity, especially in a land without structure or mercy left. The U.S. Army had already seen the ruins of the Reich. Civilians were starving, former Nazis hiding, children wandering alone through wrecked villages. The women in the camp surely knew it too. Some had families in the Soviet zone, others had nowhere to return. The American fence was not just confinement. It was protection. In reports later filed to command, a few officers noted an unusual phrase among their observations: prisoners unwilling to leave at time of release. Hayes read those words and paused before signing. He didn't blame them, because outside those gates, Germany itself had become a prison with no walls. Morning broke through a pale northern sky. The camp was unusually still. Captain Hayes stood before the main gate, clipboard in hand, as a small group of guards waited nearby. The order had come directly from division headquarters: release all non-essential POWs immediately. The war was over. The prisoners were to be processed, then sent home. The key turned in the lock, a harsh metallic click echoing across the yard. The gates creaked open, their hinges stiff from rain and rust. Dozens of women gathered near the fence line, their faces drawn and watchful. Some carried small bundles tied with twine. A few clothes, a comb, perhaps a photograph. Hayes stepped aside and gave the signal. "Gates open," he said quietly. "You're free to go." No one moved. The air hung heavy with the scent of mud and smoke. A few women whispered to one another, eyes darting between the open road and the familiar fences. One began to cry. Another turned away, clutching her bag. Hayes frowned. "You don't understand," he said, louder now. "It's over." But they did understand. They simply couldn't believe that anything waited beyond that gate, except hunger, ruin, and shame. Freedom to them no longer meant safety. It meant disappearance. For several long minutes, no one crossed the threshold. The open gate stood like a wound between two worlds, one broken, one uncertain. Hayes lowered his clipboard, watching as the women shifted uneasily, but stayed rooted in place. A gust of wind rattled the wire fence. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang from a town still half in ruins. The sound carried across the camp, a haunting reminder that the world outside had moved on without them. One woman, perhaps in her 30s, stepped forward. Her uniform jacket hung loosely on her shoulders. She paused just before the gate, staring at the open road, then looked back toward the barracks, toward the guards, the tents, the thin routine that had become her life. After a moment, she turned around and walked back inside. Others followed, silently. Hayes didn't stop them. He only watched, jaw clenched, as the last few drifted away, disappearing into the rows of wooden huts. The gate remained open, swinging slightly in the breeze. To the Americans, it was an act of mercy, the restoration of liberty. To the prisoners, it was a doorway into nothingness. When Hayes finally ordered the gate closed again, it wasn't an act of control. It was an act of understanding. In Bonn, the days that followed, word spread quietly through the Allied command chain. An entire group of German female POWs had refused release. It sounded impossible, even absurd. Yet reports from multiple camps across northern Germany told the same story. Women who had been offered freedom simply stayed. American officers filed formal statements. Some noted fear of Soviet capture. Others wrote of voluntary retention. But behind the bureaucracy was a far deeper truth, one that no official document could capture. The women were not just afraid of the Red Army, they were afraid of what waited within their own country. Post-war Germany was a land of ghosts. Cities were hollow shells, rail lines twisted, bridges gone. For returning prisoners, there were no homes to reclaim, no communities to return to. Food was scarce. Violence was common. And for anyone who had served, even in a clerical role, suspicion followed everywhere. So they remained, sweeping barracks, mending uniforms, cooking for the guards. What had begun as forced captivity slowly became a fragile, voluntary exile. Some called it survival. Others called it shame. Captain Hayes never reported another escape attempt, because no one wanted to leave. For many, captivity had become their only version of peace. By late summer 1945, Allied authorities began closing the temporary camps. Repatriation teams arrived to process the remaining prisoners, issuing new papers marked Entlassung, discharge. Trucks waited to transport them toward nearby towns and refugee centers. But even then, many resisted. Some pleaded to remain as workers or aides for the American units. Others simply lingered, sitting on their bedrolls long after their names were called. Gradually, the camps emptied. A few women were absorbed into reconstruction efforts, assisting medical corps or serving as translators. Others drifted into the civilian chaos, blending into the sea of displaced persons that covered post-war Germany. A small number never returned home at all. Records show that some emigrated years later to Canada, the United States, or Argentina, carrying with them a silence they rarely broke. The U.S. Army's final reports were clinical. Camp dissolved. Prisoners released without incident. Yet behind those brief lines were months of uncertainty, of human souls caught between guilt and survival. Captain Hayes left Germany before winter. He never forgot the sound of that gate creaking open, nor the faces that turned away from freedom. To him, they were not enemies anymore, just people trapped in a world where the fences made more sense than the future. When the last camp gates closed in 1945, the war was technically over, but the battle for meaning had only just begun. For the women who stayed behind those fences, captivity had become a strange mirror of their own nation's condition. Germany itself was a prisoner now, divided, occupied, stripped of power, and haunted by what it had done. The physical barbed wire they once feared had transformed into something almost merciful. It gave shape to a chaos that otherwise had none. Historians later called their refusal to leave a psychological reaction, a symptom of post-war dislocation. But those who were there knew it was simpler and more human. These women had seen their world burn. They had watched entire cities vanish, seen ideals collapse into rubble. Freedom without stability meant stepping into emptiness. Captivity, at least, had structure. Rations, order, safety. In time, most of them would walk through those gates. Some found homes again. Others married Allied soldiers or moved abroad. Yet none ever fully escaped that moment. The morning the lock turned, the gate swung open, and they realized that freedom can sometimes feel heavier than chains. The silence that followed their story was not one of guilt alone, but of memory. The kind that lingers quietly between the lines of official history. It reminds us that war doesn't end when the shooting stops. It ends when people remember how to live without fear. And for those women, standing in the soft northern light of a defeated Germany, that lesson came slowly. They were prisoners of war, then prisoners of peace, and finally, prisoners of memory. Beyond that fence lay a world trying to rebuild itself, a world uncertain, fragile, and new. But for one fleeting moment in 1945, a U.S. Army captain understood something profound. Sometimes the hardest part of war is learning how to walk through the gate.